Is there a backstory to the resignation, reassignment, removal, whatever the case is, to General Shoigu, the defense minister, for whom you and others on this show have had respect as a military tactician?
Well, I don't think Shoigu, strictly speaking, judges a military man. He is not a lifelong soldier or professional soldier. He was the Minister of Defense. It's just that in Russia and many other countries, the ministers of defense wear uniforms, just as during World War II, as Minister of Defense or Minister of War and Minister of the Navy and so forth, Winston Churchill ran around in a uniform. But these are civilians, and he is a civilian. And some people actually blame him for some things that did not go well at the beginning. And that's a matter for discussion. I know he was certainly chastised for his failure to handle the bit of a rebellion that took place. And, that's neither here nor there. He still enjoys the trust and confidence of President Putin ultimately. I also know that Shoigu wanted to retire a couple of years ago and was actually asked to stay on. And I think he stayed on as long as Putin thought it was necessary. I think Putin sees this war in its end phase. Now, he's not waging a war of annihilation against Ukraine, much to his credit, as we've discussed previously.
Right.
So he's looking for an end of this war, and he's decided that it's time to refocus attention. One way to do that is with a new minister who is preeminently an economist. Because one of the things that Mr. Putin and others found out about the Russian military establishment and its supporting industries is that it needed a lot of work, particularly in terms of preparation, organization to fight effectively, and logistics and sustainment. I think this is the real reason, because I think Putin now has great confidence in the generals that are commanding the forces in the field. That doesn't need anyone's particular attention at this point. They're doing a very solid job, and I think the Russian general staff is doing a good job. So for his purposes, this is opening a new chapter in the history of the Russian armed forces and the Russian state. We're going to refocus our attention on preparations for the future and on economic sense. And that's probably a good thing, frankly.
What will NATO do when the Ukraine military has collapsed?
Well, I think we can bet right now the answer to that is about nothing. I think Washington was very, very taken aback by the belligerent stance taken by Mr. Putin when he deployed those tactical nuclear weapons to the front and made it clear, if you're considering intervention in Western Ukraine, think again. You will be at war with Russia, and we are prepared for that fight. Well, we are obviously not prepared for that fight, and NATO is not prepared for that fight. And the analogy of Normandy that I gave you earlier would be exactly accurate in terms of its application to NATO today. It would be a gaggle of armies and air forces and some naval forces struggling to cooperate and fight against an enemy that has absolute unity of command and, as a result, absolute unity of effort. We have nothing like it. So I think the answer is we're not going to do anything. We're going to stand back. We're going to wait for this tragedy to unfold. I don't even think that the CIA or MI6 are necessarily going to intervene to remove Zelensky. I suspect that that's going to happen internally by other people before long.
That was my next question, which I'll frame this way. Would there have to be regime change in Kyiv before there can be negotiations between Ukraine and Russia? I would think so.
Well, at the very least, Mr. Zelensky and those who are his confidants will have to go away. Now, whether they go peacefully or they end up, being stood up against the wall and shot or poisoned or something else is anybody's guess. Maybe they'll be allowed to get in an aircraft and fly off to Cyprus or somewhere. But I think the rest of it, that's another matter. I think the Russians have actually expected a military leadership revolt to take over and put an end to the slaughter and the pointlessness of the fighting. I think that's in part why the Russians are still moving deliberately and cautiously. They are advancing across the front, and yes, they have concentrated 100,000 troops to the north to deal with Kharkov, but I think they would prefer a negotiated settlement. And they're hoping, and I suspect they may well be talking to some people behind the scenes to try and affect that.
This is the Russian military literally walking into villages from which civilians have fled and for which there was no defense whatsoever offered by Ukrainian military. This was reported by Ukrainian troops as well. But what are President Putin's military objectives, aside from the grand objective of the neutrality of Ukraine? For example, does the Russian military control all of the areas east of its front lines, or are there still rogue areas in there, rogue from the Russian perspective, still under control of the Ukrainian government?
Well, I think it's less an issue of rogue and more an issue of where there are true Ukrainians. If you look at the areas where the Russians are now, those areas are largely Russian in content in terms of people, culture, language, history.
Right.
As you move closer to the Dnieper River, you do now encounter pockets of people who are truly Ukrainian. That's all the way up and down the Dnieper from what they call Dnipro, all the way up to Kiev.
Both sides or just the west of the river?
No, on the east side. I mean, these are not heavy concentrations, but in the back of his mind, remember, he really doesn't want to rule Ukrainians. This is what nobody gets. Everybody says, oh, well, he wants to conquer Ukraine. Forget it. He doesn't want anything to do with it. This is a man who's read Solzhenitsyn very carefully. And on the whole, he's very much a disciple of Solzhenitsyn. And Solzhenitsyn always urged the Russians to leave places where the people were not Russian. Now, Solzhenitsyn did regard the Ukrainians as a related people, a brother nation, if you will. And I think Putin does too, but he's not a fool. So I don't think there's any interest in doing anything west of the Dnieper River except Odessa. And as far as the rest of it is concerned, I think he's going to continue to advance. And if there is no movement in Kiev, he will close that gap and everything east of the river will be Russian. And that serves his purpose, which is to have a neutral zone on the other side, essentially a demilitarized zone. We could have had that, as you know, back in at the end of March and beginning of April with less loss of territory to Ukraine, but that's another story.
You're talking about March and April of 2 years ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago, excuse
me.
Yeah.
Right. What happens if NATO puts forces east of the Dnieper River?
Do you mean east or west? You're talking about going into Western Ukraine?
Yeah.
Well, they're going to be at war with Russia. Russia will move decisively to crush them. And Mr. Putin has already made it very clear that the bases that support those troops, whether these are logistical hubs, missile and rocket batteries, air defense forces, airfields, aircraft, whatever they are, they will be targeted and destroyed. And that means that everybody on Russia's periphery that supports the projection of NATO military power into Western Ukraine will be attacked. And I think it's been made very clear in private by everybody in NATO that they're not interested in that. They don't want to go to war with Russia. They don't want to be attacked. And I think, that's the last thing in the world that President Biden wants for reasons that you're familiar with. We've got an election coming up. What could be worse than a major war? He's already viewed through this lens of failure in foreign policy. He failed in the execution of the Afghan withdrawal. That was a debacle. Could have been handled radically differently. Every mistake you could make, timing, location, everything was made. Now he faces something similar in Ukraine and potentially also in Israel, because no one knows what could conceivably suddenly occur in the Middle East to completely change the calculus. He thinks he's calmed things down with Iran. Well, for the moment, perhaps, but there's no guarantee there, and there's no guarantee of what will happen in Egypt or Turkey. So I think he wants an end to this thing in Ukraine, but he doesn't know how to do it, because in order to get an ending, he's got to admit the failure publicly. And, everybody in Washington never admits failure. And you have little people like Leslie Graham that'll say, well, you failed. You don't know what you've done. It's absurd. But we went through this at the end of Vietnam, and remember who lost China in the 50s?
Right.
Well, China never belonged to us. Vietnam never belonged to us, and Ukraine doesn't belong to us.
It's the same mentality, Colonel, that dominates the leadership of the State Department, the West Wing, and the leadership of the Defense Department. The same mentality. It almost doesn't matter who the president is. Here's the official United States position on all of this. I'm chuckling because you'll see how absurd it is. Admiral Kirby on Russian threats, cut number 1, Chris.
There's been threats from Moscow in the last couple of days about striking British military facilities and also simulating nuclear drills as it sharply rises tensions because of weapons manufactured in the UK being used in the conflict. This says it could potentially apply to